Okay. Uh, Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ex-Tankie Podcast, where we discuss the politics of genocide and war crimes denial. However, this episode is going to be slightly different to my previous ones. As well as challenging and debunking tanky talking points, I'd also like this platform to raise awareness of real crimes committed by Western powers that I believe more attention should be devoted to by leftists instead of just shilling for dictators like Putin or Assad. Therefore, in this episode, I'm going to be discussing Boris Johnson's foreign policy legacy and the reality of so-called global Britain with David Taylor. So David is the founder and vice chair of the Labour Campaign for International Development, which is a socialist society which campaigns for progressive policies on foreign aid, R2P, taxes, climate change, education, and more to deliver for the world's poorest. The LCID also has a range of fantastic speakers on humanitarian issues that you can invite to your local CLP meeting on their website. So David, let's begin with the first of the two main topics I'd like to discuss with you today. So could you explain the Saudi intervention against the Houthi rebels and the effects that this has had on the population of Yemen, just for someone who's unaware of this conflict?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to go through it. It's actually an issue that I worked on at Oxfam a few years ago when I worked there in the government relations team, and unfortunately, the situation has just got worse. It started off as an intervention against the Houthi rebels by the Saudi government in support of the legitimate government of Yemen. And unfortunately, the way the war has been conducted has been absolutely appalling, and it's now one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian crises in the world. So 24 million people in that country are dependent on aid. Bearing in mind this was already a very poor country, the war has just made it so bad that 24 million people are now dependent on aid. There have been over 230,000 people who have died. Over 100,000 have been killed during the fighting, while over 130,000 have died from the various humanitarian consequences, such as through starvation, through malnutrition, and so on. 140,000 children have died, and it's estimated that of the children that have survived, they have lost about 2 years of school life through this, as the school system has been completely devastated. It's the largest cholera outbreak ever recorded, with over 2 million cases. So it's just an appalling situation. I mean, the rebels are no heroes. They are fighting against the legitimate government of Yemen. The rebels are backed by Iran, we believe. And there's been the reports the US have intercepted ships from Iran carrying weapons to the Houthi rebels. But the way in which this war has been conducted on the Saudi side has been absolutely appalling, which is why Oxfam and others and Labour have been campaigning against the intervention and in favour of the UK government suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
Great. Thank you, David, for that introduction to the topic. So I was wondering if you could now explain how the UK has directly supported Saudi war crimes in Yemen and how Johnson's government has continued to facilitate this.
The main thing has been through allowing arms sales to happen, along with a discrete amount of military advice. So they're two slightly different issues, but important ones. The main one though, is the arms sales. So there is quite a lot of weapons that are built by BAE systems in this country and are supplied to the Saudi government. They have been for a number of years. The Saudi government is one of their biggest customers. The issue is that the Arms Trade Treaty, which is something that Labour instigated, but the Conservatives signed up to, William Hague, when he was Foreign Secretary, signed the UK up to this. That specifies that you should not sell weapons to a country if there is a risk, not that there's proof, but there's a risk that those arms will be used to commit war crimes. And we are clearly well beyond the point where that has been met. Now I'll sort of explain why. So how does this implicate the government? Well, they implicate the government because the government has licenses that gives BAE systems the license to sell those arms to countries around the world. So at any point, they should have said, no, we're signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty. There is a real risk here that these weapons are going to be used in violation of humanitarian law. We are suspending the sales. But they haven't done that. Now, it has relied on campaigners taking this to the courts to try and get it stopped. And when I was at Oxfam, this was something that we as Oxfam were pushing for, along with the campaign against the arms trade. We weren't successful on that occasion, but on another occasion, with the case a lot stronger, unfortunately, the situation was so much more worse, they were able to win a court of appeal. The Court of Appeal declared in 2019 that the sales to Saudi Arabia were unlawful and ordered that they be suspended. That lasted about a year, and then that expired as a court order, and the UK government immediately returned to allowing those sales to continue, which is absolutely appalling. However, it's good to see that the Campaign Against the Arms Trade and other campaigners have won permission for this to go to the High Court again. So it could be that the Arms Trade Treaty is eventually upheld, just not by the government. The second issue, which is less of an issue, I mean, it is an issue, but it's not on the same scale, is that the UK government is providing military advice to the Saudi government. Well, allegedly, I'm not sure, I'm not on top of the detail of whether this has been in public or been proven yet. When I was Oxfam, they were still disputing they were doing this. Here's I mean, their argument was, well, isn't it better that we're trying to advise them to target their weapons in a better way? That was their argument. I personally doesn't satisfy me, but that's one of the issues has been as well, is that they have been providing military advice to the Saudis, and it clearly hasn't been, if that has been their intention, we take them on their word, then it clearly hasn't been having the impact that they think it should, because 230,000 people have died.
Absolutely, yeah, that's great, David. Thanks for that insightful analysis. And that point you touched on there, I've seen Tory MPs like Crispin Blunt make that argument that if we should continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia in order to leverage them into better behavior, and that if we stop selling arms to the Saudis, then states that care even less about the rights of Muslims, like Russia, will just take our place and sell them weapons instead. And they argue that could make the situation even worse. So I have two questions that I was wondering. First, if you could talk about why you don't believe that that's the case, and secondly, what else can the UK government do beyond cutting arms deals to actually stop the war in Yemen? Because I don't believe that would be a complete silver bullet. There would still be a conflict even if the UK government wasn't arming the Saudis.
Well, I completely agree on that second point, and let me come back to it. On your first point, I mean, first of all, Crispin Blunt is just wrong on pretty much every issue I can think of. And we talk about tankies. I mean, he is often seen at Stop the War events as a useful idiot for their arguments. He's wrong on Libya. He's wrong on Syria. He's wrong on Brexit. I'm so glad that he's not chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And Tom Tugendhat, although he is a Conservative, is at least someone who does believe in upholding humanitarian law and was an advocate with Jo Cox when she was alive for taking a better approach in Syria. So anyway, thank God he is not. Blunt is no longer there. I mean, on this argument about China and Russia, and because there's also an argument that has been made that France will just fill the void on arms sales too. It just doesn't wash for us as progressives, does it? Because it morally is an argument, it just doesn't stack up. So even if that is the case, well, at this point, how can they make things worse anyway? Because it's the world's worst humanitarian situation alongside Syria. But in any case, we've got to, especially with the Biden administration, although they're not going as far as we'd like them to, we've got to seize the opportunity to try and have a better relationship with Saudi Arabia, because the idea that we just tolerate their horrific behavior at home and abroad because of supposed benefits to us, I just don't think is acceptable. I mean, one of the other arguments is around has always been around, as I understand it, and I'm not a domestic terrorism expert, but the argument has been, well, they're providing lots of useful intelligence for us that's helping thwart attacks in the UK. Well, there has to be a way in which there has to be a way around that doesn't involve us pumping billions of pounds worth of arms to Yemen. For example, as I understand it, there isn't any ban on, well, maybe there is, but there's been an interesting book called Between the Mosques that's come out recently, where Ed Hussein's been looking at some of the issues around domestic extremism in the UK. And as I understand it, I may be wrong, but I'm not sure that there's a ban on religious teachers from Saudi Arabia teaching in the UK. And I'm not sure why we haven't shut that off if we've got the problem with domestic terrorism. But I say that with a caveat that I'm not a domestic terrorism expert, but I'm just not satisfied with these kind of arguments as to why we should just let the Saudi relationship continue like this. What I would like to do is have more conversations within Labour with Labour MPs about some of these different issues, because there have been concerns on the Labour side about the impact on jobs of suspending arms sales. Now, I don't think it's justified to continue. We signed the Arms Trade Treaty and we've got to stick up to it. But it is a reasonable concern. It's a reasonable concern to be concerned about the impact on jobs. But surely there's a way we can get through this and around this. And I'd love us to have more conversations about what that looks like, because these are important concerns, but they're not ones which we should use as an excuse to carry on the relationship as it is.
Absolutely, yeah. And on the second point about what to do if we were to cut arms deals, what would be the next step after that?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that question. Well, I think that we should be using the US suspension of arms to Saudi Arabia as an opportunity to have a renewed push on peace talks. And Tobias Ellwood, who's the chair of the Defence Select Committee, said recently that that's what he thought what drove the US decision to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to force the Saudis to the table to talk peace. We've undermined that by saying that we're going to continue to sell the arms sales. So I don't think any of us know what how those peace talks would go, but clearly it's difficult for us to be the pen holder on Yemen at the UN, which we are, alongside our role in supplying arms to one of the sides of it. So there's got to be a renewed push on peace talks. I don't know what the solutions are to that. I know it's easy to say, oh, we should have peace talks. And I've been critical of Labour under Corbyn for saying that on Syria and not proposing anything else. But I do think that would be one important thing. The other thing that I think is important saying, I know we're going to go on to, is the impact of the aid cuts, because they have slashed aid through the aid cuts to Yemen by 2/3, which is a colossal amount. So another thing the UK could do is stop cutting aid to Yemen, because it's one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world.
Absolutely, yeah. And that segues nicely into the other primary topic that I wanted to discuss with you today, which is aid cuts. So the UK is the only G7 nation this year to cut foreign aid. So I was wondering if you could explain what the effects of cutting aid from the UK will be for its current recipients.
Well, I mean, quite simply, less aid equals less lives saved. I think it's very popular to say aid is a sticking plaster. Aid is not getting to the structural causes of poverty. And LCID, we firmly believe that you should address the structural causes of poverty, and you should have fairer trade and tax justice and climate justice and so on and so forth. And we'll get onto this, I know. But aid does make a difference. It does save lives. So if you cut it, it's logical that it will have a negative impact. And numerous estimates from various charities, from Andrew Mitchell, the Conservative who was leading the rebellion on the Conservative side, have estimated that this will cost around 100,000 lives a year. So if you multiply that over several years, and it looks after this week's appalling vote that this aid cut will be in place until at least 2025, then it is going to just have a devastating effect. And that's, it's preventable deaths. It's deaths that could have been saved by ensuring that people had access to medicine or had vaccinations or didn't suffer from malnutrition and so on and so forth. I've already mentioned Yemen. I believe that in addition to that 2/3 cut, there's a cut of 1/3 to Syria. It could be more, but I think it's 1/3. Funding to girls' education, to give another example, will be 1/4 less this year. Funding to malaria is being cut by 2/3, and it just goes on and on and on. There's just been so many stories of charities being, or not even just charities, but big global funds having their contributions undermined, and all done at the last minute as well. So that's the other thing, that is people are finding contracts have been just cancelled at the last minute and so on and so forth, with no real opportunity to try and source alternative funds. And it all comes, of course, at a time when the world is suffering a pandemic, where that pandemic has hit in two ways. One has been the jobs crisis, because as we've had lockdowns, countries have not been able to bring in their own furlough scheme in the way that we have, because they have to borrow from the international markets. They can't afford to borrow from themselves as we do. So they haven't been able to do that. And then initially, it seems like a lot of the developing countries were not suffering from this pandemic in the same way that we were in Europe and the US. We think, and this is just subjective, we'd obviously have to do the proper analysis. We think sometimes it's actually because these places were underdeveloped, because the infrastructure wasn't there. It just wasn't traveling as fast, because people weren't traveling as fast. But anyway, unfortunately, the new variants just mean that goes out the window. And we've seen the devastating effect it's having in India and Brazil and elsewhere. So it just comes at the worst possible moment. And you mentioned the G7 there. I mean, that summit was a real disappointment. We got 1 billion doses donated. By the end of next year, we need 11 billion. We need $60 billion worth of money to help finance the distribution of doses. And the UK continues to drag its feet on waiving the IP rights around the vaccines as well. So, yeah, it's been a very disappointing and devastating time, to be honest.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you for that great explanation. So the government have claimed that the foreign aid cuts are necessary due to the current economic state of the UK in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you feel about this argument that it's that the cuts are necessary?
Well, remember, I think the first thing to say is to remember that it's already gone down, because it is tied to our gross national income. It's 0.7 of our GNI. So there was always going to be a decrease in aid anyway. But personally, I didn't want the act to be written in that way. I would have preferred that it was always a ceiling and that it didn't go up and down according to what happened that year. But politically, that wasn't realistic. And we are where we are. But the point being is that it's already, by their argument, tied to what we as a country can afford. It's tied to our GNI. So it's already going to be going down this year. What they've done is an additional cut of about 4 billion by bringing it down to 0.5%, which is just completely unnecessary. Now, as you mentioned at the start when you introduced LCID, we are an organisation that is in favour of responsibility to protect. So I don't like making this argument, because I do believe that our armed forces do need to be invested in order so that they can be a force that protects civilians around the world. They've just had a 4 billion increase. So why is it we can afford that and not this? The answer, in my view, is that we can afford to do both. The Tories are just making an ideological decision not to. The overall deficit is very large. 4 billion in that context is not a huge amount of money. It's certainly not the sort of money that is going to cause interest rates to skyrocket up. So I just don't think that this is a necessary cut. These are exactly the same arguments that we had during the austerity years after the financial crisis. No one's arguing that deficit won't need to come down eventually, but the key is in the eventually. Well, this is debt we owe to ourselves as a country. We borrowed from the Bank of England. We will pay it back, but we will pay it back over time. And we have some of the lowest interest rates in history. So there is just absolutely no need to have any austerity at home or abroad, just as there wasn't after the financial crisis. So it's deeply frustrating time, and it just, for me, comes down to the Conservatives' ideology. That's just who they are. That is part of their politics, and it's not what we in Labour ever think should happen. We've always been in favour of Keynesian economics, and you don't cut during a recession or during difficult times. It's just not the time to do it.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's frustrating seeing that money go towards a yacht or what.
Oh yeah, the yacht. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's another example. 200
Yeah.
million on what? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So is it true that one of the government's primary motivations in cutting foreign aid is to appeal to the red wall? And if this is the case, is cutting foreign aid really a popular policy among working class voters?
I don't know how much it drove their decision. I think it's actually more to do with the personal views and ambitions of the individuals involved. Sunak wants to become prime minister. I mean, the guy's a billionaire, so the fact that he is cutting aid to the bottom billion is just so galling. Why can't he just go off on a yacht somewhere and not stop ruining people's lives? Is my general view of him. It annoys me the way he has this little persona of, oh, aren't I a happy-go-lucky guy? Well, not when you're cutting aid for the world's poorest, mate. So he obviously wants to look tough to position himself. He knows this will be popular with some aspects of the Conservative backbenchers. I say some because you have to give credit to Mitchell and others who've been leading this rebellion, but there is no doubt there are others that this will appeal to, and he has an eye on the leadership contest in the future, so this makes sense for him. Johnson has always disliked aid. When he was Foreign Secretary, he resented the fact that DFID had more money than the Foreign Office, and he couldn't wait to cut DFID as a department, as we saw with the merger. So that's that. I think on the issue of public opinion, there's no getting around the fact that there's work to do. The latest polling I've seen says that there's a majority of about 53% for aid amongst the public, but that is of the overall public. So what it is like in so-called red wall seats is a different matter. And of course, like, I can understand the argument about charity begins at home when there's so many problems in the UK, particularly now. I really am sympathetic to that. But on the other hand, there's a huge amount of kindness and generosity of the British public, and I'm not sure of the source. It might be a few years out of date now, but I'm pretty sure that if you look at the proportion that people give to charity of their income, it's people on lower incomes who give the most to charity. I may be wrong, but so I think it's a mistake to assume that they are definitely opposed to aid. Clearly, the media reports over the last decade have not helped. All the stupid stories in the Daily Mail about the one tiny bit of aid wastage that they've managed to find, even though it's the world leading, DFID was a world leading department, our aid was consistently ranked amongst the most effective in the world. And unfortunately was also undermined by the Conservatives themselves. Even Mitchell, who I have a lot of respect for, every single Conservative Secretary of State for International Development would come in and try and say, I found waste, I'm going to tackle it, without seeing the bigger picture and the strategic error of undermining development. Mitchell did it, came in and said that we had been profligate as Labour, but we hadn't. He found like one project in Hackney he didn't like and gave that to the Daily Mail. Justin Green did the same, and so on and so forth. So it's challenging. I think what we've got to do as Labour, as LCID, as an international development sector, is just try and win that argument with the public and be led by the evidence, talk to people, understand what their concerns are, try and find ways to get through to them, find the messages via focus groups and so on that will cut through. As I understand it, looking at sort of the evidence, think when you are able to have a conversation with people about the impact that aid makes, and get away from this idea that it's all been wasted on salaries and so on and so forth, if you can have real proper stories about the way in which it's actually transforming people's lives, I think they really warm to that. And I also think that stories that show that it's helping make the situation better in the long term, helping people stand on their own 2 feet, is a good one. The Ebola crisis was a good opportunity to do that, because we were able to point to aid projects that had not only helped deal with the immediate health crisis, but had then helped Sierra Leone rebuild its health system, rebuild its tax system, so they wouldn't be as reliant on aid. And I think people responded to that. But that's the work we've got to do, is to really up our games on the comm side. And also, and I'm speaking more in terms of the international development sector, just invest more in the grassroots community-based activism, which we're trying to do, but it's just a hard slog of trying to reinvigorate support for development in communities themselves in some of these red wall seats. So, because we know that people are more responsive to what their neighbour has to say. And if their neighbour's saying, well, actually, I'm part of this local group and we run a stall at a local church and we do, etc., that's going to have more resonance with them than anything I would say. So it's
Great. Thanks for that explanation, David. So finally, on the topic of foreign aid, what could the UK achieve if it was to commit to spending even more on foreign aid than 0.7% of GNI? And what other policies should the UK pursue that it currently is not to enhance economic justice abroad?
Well, I think if Labour were back in power, we could get back to what we were doing really when we left office in 2010. One of which was an increasing focus on trying to build up a country's education, aid, and health system. So, what you can do is something called budget support, which is where instead of spending money on lots of different projects, you give the government of, say, Kenya, a certain amount of money and say, look, would like you to earmark this for your health system, please. But we're not going to put too many strings attached. Please take that money, and it enables them to make decisions that work for them about how to build up Kenya's health system, and the same on education and so on and so forth. Now, there are challenges with that, but particularly where the government in question has questionable human rights. That's a real live debate we're always going to have because it's a really difficult one. You start giving aid to a country and then a new government comes in and they start committing violations. The instinct is to say that you pull out immediately, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But you also have to think about the implications, because then you're potentially pulling the rug from underneath ordinary people by pulling that aid out. So that's why there's been a move sometimes away from that and back to more project-based funding. But I think as much as possible, you should be trying to work through governments, building up government systems. That's the most sustainable thing. But of course, if there are human rights violations, you do need to find other channels for that aid. But beyond aid, we as LCID have always been interested, as I said, in the structural causes of poverty. And for me, it's always about a range of macroeconomic levers. So yes, aid, but also debt cancellation. The great thing about the debt cancellation that we did in the mid-2000s was that it did mean that countries were able to start spending more money on education and on health because they were no longer servicing unsustainable debt. Tax justice is another one, both in terms of, they do intertwine, because aid, of course, can help with tax justice too, because aid can help build up the capacity of a country to have its own taxation system. But tax justice, I know we're going to come on to this in a moment, but tax justice is important in terms of getting more revenue for those governments by ensuring that corporations pay more. Trade justice is another one. Now that we're out of the EU, we've got to ensure that our trade deals are fair. As things stand, they're carrying over the deals that they have with the EU, which is good, because a number of those deals have preferential access that enables tariff-free access into the UK market from some of the poorest countries in the world. So that's good. But we've got to make sure that in these negotiations, we are not strong-arming countries into things that they don't want to agree to for our benefit. Then there's the arguments around reforming some of the big institutions. So the World Bank and IMF come an awful long way from the Washington Consensus, the bad old days of the 80s. They've actually been pretty progressive, I think, on a number of issues for a number of years now. We've got to keep that up. The G20, when Gordon was Prime Minister, really drove that forum to try and push forward various issues, including responding to the global financial crisis, but also ensuring that some money reached developing countries. That has fallen away, really. It's not just the Tories' fault. It's you can look to the Obama administration and criticise them there a bit. It's also hard to work coherently together when you've got countries like Russia that are being deliberately obstructive as well. But that could be that for me is another agenda. What are the global deals you can strike to try and respond to COVID, for example? And I think that is our hope now that the G7 has failed, that the G20 does step up and come up with some kind of deal on COVID that enables vaccines to be going to the world's poorest countries. So yeah, I think that's a good overview.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, David. So to finish off, now we've discussed the main topics that I'd like to touch on. I have a series of smaller questions. So first of all, I'd like to start with a topic that's quite closely related to foreign aid, which is tax havens. And tax havens are relevant when discussing foreign aid because it's estimated by the OECD that developing countries actually lose 3 times more of their wealth to tax havens than they receive in foreign aid. So in light of this, has the UK responded adequately to Biden's proposed global corporation tax?
Well, unfortunately, quite the opposite. Biden started off with a 21% rate, which I think he's still going to implement in the US, which is a good thing. But the G7 agreement was only for 15%, and it was Sunak who was driving. So that was deeply frustrating. At least there was a deal. But he immediately has tried to get exemptions for the City of London. So that, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen there, but that is just typical. It does seem to have some problems as a deal. The Tax Justice Network, who are a group of NGOs working on tax justice globally, have been quite critical of it, as their understanding is that the current proposals would be unfair on developing countries in the sense that most of the tax would go to G7 countries rather than reaching developing countries themselves. So I think that's a very that is very concerning. Personally, I'm just glad that we have a deal at all. I know I don't want to undermine what Tax Justice Network is saying in any way. I think they're right to keep pushing on this stuff, but compared to where we've been, to actually have the US backing a global deal on tax is a remarkable thing. Because even Joe Biden, as I understand it, Joe Biden was personally quite was not particularly supportive of this agenda when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister and trying to push this through the G20, the G7, because I think Delaware is a major tax haven or something like that, but his home state. So the fact that he's moved on this is really positive. The Larry Summers, who was at the Treasury at the time in the US, I think played a quite negative role in blocking attempts to address this issue 10 years ago as well. So the fact that he's no longer there and that this is happening is a really good thing. It's just really disappointing that we have a Conservative government who have been opposed to it. But at least, despite that, something has happened, and I just hope that we can find a way to ensure that this does reach developing countries and they can benefit from it.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree. So now let's discuss the UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So how could the UK improve its approach to increasing the global vaccine rollout?
Well, they missed their big opportunity, unfortunately, which was the G7. They were hosts. They should have been putting forward a proposal to deal with this in a comprehensive way. Well, in some ways, they were part of something called the COVAX initiative and have tried to, at least initially, try and position themselves as being at the forefront of a global response. But the fact is that, as I think I mentioned earlier, the G7 only committed to 1 billion doses. 500 million are coming from the US. I believe that a lot of these doses aren't going to arrive until the end of September, and most of them until next year. So it's just too little, too late. It's been estimated that 11 billion are needed, and only 1 billion have been provided. And it's estimated that about 60 billion is needed over 2 years to deal with the delivery and the rollout of that vaccine. So it's not saying that UK should stump up the cash for all of that, but they could have contributed, and they could have used their role as the host of the G7 to try and get a deal. And you just know that if it had been a Labour government, if it had been someone like Gordon Brown there, well, we know this because he was in the news every day begging the G7 to do this, and we would have had a different outcome. We would have been working really, really hard to try and get a global deal on vaccines. And where was Boris Johnson? Well, he had his honeymoon a few weeks before. Now, I don't begrudge him having a honeymoon, but could he not have waited until now? I mean, it's just crazy. So we've just got to hope that the G20 makes some progress on this, that the US can offer more. It's deeply frustrating. You do see that China and Russia are offering their own vaccines, but there are questions over their effectiveness, for one, and there are also questions over their motives, because there's been reports that they are saying that they should not give vaccines. Look, countries will only get vaccines if they don't take certain positions in international forum. So we'll have to see how we get on. The UK, I'm afraid, the Tories don't get any credit from us for what they've achieved so far. The final thing to say is related to this is the intellectual property around this. They've refused to waive the IP around this. Now, I don't think that's a silver bullet. I think it's right that campaigners are calling for IP, intellectual property, to be waived on these vaccines. It's not a silver bullet, and the reason is because only a certain number of countries have the capacity to produce vaccines, even with the IP. So you do need more money going in regardless, but it doesn't help, does it? So that's another thing. Yet that is another thing that the UK has blocked.
Absolutely. To finish off, we spent a lot of time discussing Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, but I would like to discuss the Labour Party briefly as well. So there's been a lot of discussion about the tolerance of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party under Corbyn, but there's one other topic that I don't think gets enough as much attention as it deserves. So I was wondering if you could explain how Corbyn also made the Labour Party a safe place for support for Bashar al-Assad.
Well, I completely agree, and it's been a huge amount of caused a huge amount of shame for us in LCID, and a lot of people have wrestled with their conscience about whether to leave the Labour Party over the last few years, both in regards to this issue and also, as you say, the anti-Semitism crisis. I certainly have, known many people who left the Labour Party during that time, and I completely respect them. And the only reason I stayed was because I was trying to fight against the people that had taken over our party and caused these crises. In terms of why, I mean, he and certainly his core team, including his right-hand man, this guy called Seamus Milne, just subscribed to this, as you know, this far-left nonsense worldview that says the West and the US are the cause of all the world's ills, and that the enemy of my enemy is therefore my friend. And I can see why outside of that core group that appeals to, or has appealed to, other people in the Labour Party. But if you've got an older generation, perhaps of our parents who grew up with the Vietnam War, then of course they would have seen the US commit war crimes and be sympathetic to that worldview. Similarly, you have a younger generation, including us, who've grown up in the shadow of the Iraq War and seen the US crimes there. And then, of course, in the middle, you've had Thatcher and Reaganism ripping through things in the UK, but also through the Washington Consensus, ruining the economies of developing countries too. So I understand the sentiment, and I do, but what is just disgusting about it is the way that the people at the centre, Corbyn and his team, take that to the extreme by therefore papering over what supposed enemies of the West are doing. And I do think that the US and Europe are capable of doing good things in the world. We talked a lot about what Labour achieved in terms of the deals it tried to get with the G8 and G20. There's also interventions like Kosovo and Sierra Leone where I believe we did the right things, as well as the aid and debt relief stuff we talked about. But the thing that is just unconscionable is this rush to downplay and dismiss the crimes of dictators. We've just had a by-election, a really awful, nasty by-election in Jo Cox's old seat. Her sister won but she won, and it was just such a emotional moment, because if she had lost, and she had lost because of Galloway, it would have just been the most galling thing ever, because Galloway is just against everything that Jo stood for. And let's not forget that Seamus Milne is a close friend of George Galloway. They allegedly speak on the phone every day. Corbyn had been on panels with him, so many times over the years. And this is a man who was trying to pretend that he was a fan of, a supporter of Palestine. And there were 500,000 people, as you know, Palestinians inside Syria being oppressed by Assad. And yet he goes over there and shakes his hand and pretends that, he's, and defends him, says that he's, I can't forget the quote. I've tried to get it out of my brain, but he's on record defending Assad. He went over to meet Saddam Hussein and shake his hand and say how courageous he was. And all of them, Seamus Milne has written articles in The Guardian from the time before he was an advisor, downplaying this stuff. And unfortunately, it did bleed into Labour's foreign policy positions, which was the really shameful thing. And Emily Thornberry, who is not part of that core group, but she did nonetheless say these things, and she does have to be answerable to it, came out with positions in House of Commons or on Question Time where she was casting doubt on who was responsible for these chemical weapons attacks, because presumably she'd had Seamus Milne in her ear. Or I believe at one point she had a briefing from Pete Ford, that awful Assadist former UK ambassador. So what we've tried to do as LCID is really try to be more, to try and, now that we're beyond Corbyn, not be complacent. I mean, we never were complacent, but to try and have that discussion with the members quite directly, because if we let this stuff lie and say, oh, it's just an extreme fringe, don't worry about it, well, we've just seen the consequence of that. And the consequence is that that extreme fringe became leader of the Labour Party, and our position on Syria over the last 5 years has been appalling. And who knows, if Hilary Benn had actually been and remained Shadow Foreign Secretary throughout that period of time, if we'd had a decent Labour leader instead, then perhaps we would have been doing what Jo had advocated and pushing for a no-fly zone. And perhaps we could have saved more lives in Syria. Now, we may not have been able to without US support, I don't know. But it's instead we've been in this horrible position where it's just been utterly shameful. And we've been determined to try and correct that. So we've done a lot of work with the Syrian British Council, Syrian British community in the UK, to try and say to them, look, we're really sorry about the front bench position. This is previously, this is not our position. We want to know that we do stand in solidarity with you. And as soon as we got Kieran as leader and Lisa Nandy was appointed, which was great, by the way, because she was on record saying she supported R2P, we arranged for a meeting between the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa, and her team, and Wayne David, the Shadow Middle East Minister, to meet with the Syrian British Council. We didn't speak at that meeting. We just said, look, please just meet, talk. We want Labour Syria policy to be determined by what British Syrians want us to say, and at least we're in a better place. And I would also say, in terms of the wider membership, what we're trying to do is just have a conversation with as many members as possible about this, because I do think that firstly, the membership has changed since Keir became leader. I think a lot of the worst people have left, and you would have seen in the news this week that 4 groups have been prescribed, including ones that have defended the indefensible, which is a good thing. I think the vast majority of members all along have been more sympathetic to our views than their views, that just they haven't felt equipped with the arguments. So what we're trying to do is do as many talks to local Labour parties as possible, We've got a great number of speakers. We've got Syrian activists, but we've also got activists from Bosnia, from Kosovo, and elsewhere, from Rwanda. And we found that by giving them a platform, it's not just me rabbiting on, people are actually able to hear their personal stories, and that does change minds. Because I know this is called the Ex-Tankie Podcast. Well, I have to be honest myself, I used to be a lot more of a pacifist than I am now. I was never, personally, I was a sort of interested in non-violent alternative to intervention. I was never a sort of tankie, as it were. I never was interested in defending Saddam Hussein in any way, but it was more just that, well, I wasn't convinced that violence through armed intervention was the right way about it. But two things happened. One, during the course of the anti-war process in 2003, I just got appalled by the number of people that were just not saying anything about Saddam's crimes and not showing any interest in alternative ways to get rid of him. And secondly, I went on a quite life-changing trip with British Council to Kosovo and met people same age as me, right down to the same birthday, who had just been through the most appalling things. And that obviously changes your perspective quite a lot. And that is a driver behind setting up the Speakers Network, because if we get Labour members listening to people affected by conflict, then I think we will win some of these arguments around Syria and responsibility to protect. And I have to say, just final thing is that in the talks that we've done over the past year, we've not had pushback once. There hasn't been a single angry tanky person shouting at any of our activists, which was personally something I was a bit worried about. I didn't want to put these people who've gone through a lot through listening to some idiot shout at them, but they haven't. And that's because I do think that fundamentally most Labour members are decent. They just have only heard from one side of the argument over the last few years. So yeah, I'm glad that we're in a better position. And like I say, it's good that the shadow front bench position is so much better as well.
That's great, and thank you so much, David, for coming on the podcast and talking to me about these very important issues. So, are there any other? Is there anything else you would like to add on the subject of Boris Johnson's foreign policy, or are there any projects that you're working on that you'd like to mention, or anything else?
Well, I think the main thing is for any of your listeners who are Labour members to please join us. So it's lcid.org.uk. Have a look at our website and join us as a member. And if you're part of a local Labour Party group, then you can request one of our speakers to come and talk to your CLP. What we're trying to do is just contribute to the wider movement against what Boris Johnson is trying to do as much as possible. What I mean by that is that obviously they have an 80-seat majority, so there's a limit to what Labour can do. Our primary job as LCID is to influence Labour Party policy, and that's what we've been trying to do. And Keir and Rachel were fantastic in their speeches earlier this week. So I'm not worried about Labour's position on aid at the moment and on foreign policy issues. What we're trying to do is, where there is going to be a tight parliamentary vote, ensure that we're contributing the best we can. So ensuring that there's a three-line whip on the Labour side, but also where we've got members that are in Tory-held seats, we've been encouraging them to write to their MP, hide maybe the fact that they're a Labour voter, and just say, as a constituent, I would like you to support aid in this vote, or support R2P in this vote. And we'll have to see. On the R2P side, there isn't, as you know, much prospect of much happening in Syria or elsewhere, but it's definitely in our plans, should there ever become an opportunity for there to be a no-fly zone, that we would push for that in Parliament. But,
thanks again, David, for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening. And the LCID Twitter is @LabourCID, and the website is lcid.org.uk. And thanks again, David, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thanks. See you.